So today's webinar is going to be all about MailStore SPE. It's a bit of a follow-up from James's webinar last week, where he looked more at the sales angle, why you need an archiving solution, and specifically against Office 365, which I'll be honest is the major sort of market we see for MailStore archiving across the board. Today, I'm Neil Perry. I'm more the technical consultant here at Zen Software. So I'm going to look at, quickly touch on MailStore as a product and what it can do for your customers. A quick look at archiving Office 365. I speak to a lot of customers where they're not quite sure how MailStore links into Office 365 and how much integration there is. So we'll quickly go through the concepts of archiving 365. That'll lead me into then looking at the SPE product as an architecture and how that really is another way of using MailStore with your customers to allow you to build services around MailStore. We'll look at how we can get it up and running, what's involved in actually building the platform, the different ways it can be deployed at an architecture level. Then I'll switch to a live session on a lab environment that I've built just to walk through things like setting up customers and how customers get access. A quick look at some tips and tricks that we've learned over the years, and then we'll wrap up with I know backup's a key important feature of how you would go about backing up this customer data, and in how you can use that backup to migrate customers potentially between servers, or if you needed to give that data back to the customer, how you'd go about that. Then we'll have a look at the pricing of the SPE solution, but also a look at the pricing of how you would host the product, and an example scenario that we've come up with. We've done the cost modeling, so you can get an idea of what sort of cost you can put against this product that you can potentially sell to your customers, and what sort of margins there are, where the break-even point is, and that sort of general feeling for how profitable the product can be. And then we'll finish up with questions and answers. I'll open up the microphones, or you're welcome to use the chat all throughout the presentation. And we can also look at the live session in more detail if there's any particular areas you want to discuss further. So let's start with a bit of a background look at MailStore as a product. I think most of you guys are used to using MailStore. If you've not seen it at all, this is really just the basics of what MailStore is all about. So the main MailStore server license is a single installation product. It's designed to be installed on a single server, whether that server's on site with the customer or whether it's in a hosted environment. It's one installation for a particular email customer. It can archive from either local mail platforms like Exchange, MDaemon, Kerio mail servers, or indeed any remote mail servers. Same servers, obviously, if they're in a different location. It doesn't have to be installed on the MailStore, on the actual mail server itself. Primarily, we're seeing it used a lot with Office 365 as a way of going and archiving Office 365 mailboxes, but also public folders, shared mailboxes. Whether that server's local on a customer and they're bringing the data back into site, or whether that server's hosted somewhere in the cloud, whether it's on your infrastructure as a service provider. You can also archive hosted Exchange platforms, and you can also bring in other mail sources. So if you've got lots of distributed PST archives, whether those have been created on users' personal machines, or whether you've got other third-party archiving solutions that you've exported data into PST, you can bring all of this data into a MailStore server platform. The other key useful feature of MailStore is the ability to go and synchronize the users and indeed the passwords. So that allows your users to have an account within MailStore that they can log in with. They can have single sign-on, so those user credentials are looked up live against a directory service. Now, there are different options there, but typically, we're talking about an AD synchronization. And the passwords are never actually stored in MailStore. They're looked up live against the directory server. The data that MailStore stores is all deduplicated and compressed, so it's very efficient at storing that data compared to many other email platforms. It's typically, we see about a 2:1 compression ratio over Exchange. And it's encrypted, so that the data stored on your infrastructure, or in this case, in the server, it's not stored. It has to be decrypted, and it has to be decrypted through the MailStore application before you can get access to it. Users themselves, they get their own archive within MailStore, so it's not just one big pot that the whole company's email exists in. It's separated into virtual users folders, archive folders, and those folders can be shared between users. So if you've got scenarios where users need to have access to other users' archives, specifically for searching, which is very common in businesses, then that can all be set up and permissions can be created to get access to different archives. In the server model, the licenses is set up so that it's per user per year. So there's different bands, but you purchase MailStore for the number of users you need, and then you can renew it for update support on a yearly basis. So why do Office 365 customers need additional archiving, which is sort of following on from James's webinar last week? The big sort of news article that we're seeing a lot of at the moment is concern around responsibility of Office 365 data. Typically, Office 365 customers think of their data as protected by Microsoft, and should there be a problem, I can get it back through Microsoft. It's not technically true, that statement. Microsoft are responsible for the hardware, the infrastructure, uptime of the Office 365 network, but they explicitly state that they're not responsible for users' data. If that data is attacked for numerous reasons, whether it's human error, whether users have accidentally deleted it, whether there's systems in place that have somehow managed to, wipe out a mailbox or fill a mailbox with junk. External attacks, malware is a huge issue with Office 365 at the moment because it's such a big platform. It's clearly going to be a target from malicious attackers that want to, get access to that data. If your data vanishes because of one of those reasons, Microsoft aren't guaranteed to give you that data back. You really need to think about an external solution to have a copy of that important data. On top of the Microsoft reasons, then there are still some key reasons why you want to archive all of every mail platform. Overloaded mailboxes are still an issue. We heard this week of customers saying that even in Office 365 environments, you can still be in a situation where your mailboxes are getting too big and caches aren't going to be able to cope with in Outlook. So keeping your mail platform, your live mail platform data set down to a manageable amount is always going to be the best approach. Whether that's, typically customers would maybe only keep a year or 2 years worth of email in their live mail platform and rely on archiving as a way of getting back further. It really is all about managing the amount of data in the mail infrastructure. GDPR, huge thing. Obviously, you guys should all know about GDPR, but the requirement to get access to data when you're requested to, and how you manage that and where that data is, it has to be kept in a secure way. It has to be audited as to who has access to it when. This is a key important thing. So any sort of archive solution has to be GDPR compliant. I mentioned the group visibility. I've touched on that before, but the ability for users to be able to search across archives. Microsoft's own built-in Office 365 archiving is very much an administrator's feature. If somebody needs to find something, they really have to get a mail admin, whether that's somebody on site or typically with your customers, one of your staff members, to come in and actually go and find those messages for them and release them. That process is very much a backwards and forwards case and can take a lot of your time. So having a solution where users can get their own data out of the archive is really very valuable. And another key point that I've added on, because a lot of our resellers use MailStore specifically for this purpose, is for helping migration projects. If you're moving customers from on-site, on-premise Exchange environments into 365, the sheer amount of data you have to upload can be quite a challenge. So using MailStore first to archive that platform and minimize what's in the on-site, on-premise Exchange environment to then migrate what's left makes a big difference. So I just want to talk about how MailStore works with Office 365, because I think sometimes the integrations can be overlooked. So what I've got here is just a very basic sort of setup. So when we're talking about archiving Office 365, whether it's MailStore Server or even SPE, the model is exactly the same. The starting point is user synchronization. And MailStore can synchronize with Office 365 directly through the Azure AD integration. So there's a guide that goes through the technical steps, but fundamentally what you're doing is creating an account that's allowed to query which users are within a group within 365 and synchronizing, bringing those users into MailStore. In the background, the process of checking users' accounts details are also looked up live against the same as your AD user group. So there's no need to create manual passwords in MailStore. If a user changes their password in 365, it's naturally changed automatically within MailStore. So once you've got your user set up, the next logical step is to start creating archive jobs. And typically you would create one job that would archive all of your users' mailboxes. And that requires an account within 365 that has what they call application impersonation rights. And that one account, so you only need to know the credentials of that one account, can then go and access multiple users' mailboxes. Once it's archived all those mailboxes once, the next time it comes round to archive them again, it's only having to pull in new data. So it's significantly quicker. I mean, it's a fraction of the time to update mailboxes compared to that first run. And it keeps that in a local cache. So MailStore have done a lot of work to really improve the performance so that you can be running the archive jobs on user mailboxes. Typically, we run them on an hourly basis. And that alone can be how far you take a MailStore installation with 365. You just archive user mailboxes and you repeat that process and keep it up to date. At the same time as archiving them, you can easily configure those jobs to delete old email as well. So you can use this as a way of purging and managing the mailbox sizes within 365. Those archives then get separated and sorted into users' archive folders. So even though it's one archive within MailStore, from a user's point of view, they see their own messages that were archived from their mailbox in 365. And like I said before, you can share those folders out between users. The final step, and this is where you can need a little bit more help, but there's things happening in the future to make this a lot easier, which I hopefully we'll be able to tell you about soon, is the ability to add a journaling mailbox rule. So in 365, you can turn on Exchange journaling that sends a copy of every message that arrives through 365 to an external mailbox, and that's the current requirement. It has to be a mailbox outside of 365 somewhere. We can discuss that, exactly how you can provide that yourself on your own infrastructure, and then MailStore would go and collect that mailbox typically every few minutes to get a copy of every message and then sort it into each user's archive. The main reason you would go to the effort of doing that is for compliance. If you need to guarantee that every message that's ever sent and received by a company has been archived, you need to do a form of journaling rules. So what do users get access to? You've got this great archive, it's separated out into different users' archives. How do users get access? Well, there's multiple methods for users to get access. They can either connect in with an Outlook add-in through the directly within Outlook. There's a web interface that's for desktop or mobile devices. There's also a MailStore Archive client, which adds some more archiving functionality from a user's point of view, but that's something we'll probably discuss in another session. And for those users that aren't in a Windows environment or don't want to use a web access, you can connect to the mailbox, the archive as a mailbox. That's an IMAP capable connection, a read-only mailbox. So that's typically used in Mac OS environments where you want to see it within a separate email client. So I just want to quickly show you the sort of interface. So this is a quick screen grab of the MailStore add-on within Outlook. It's up at the top there, and you can do searches on the archive, and you've got all the criteria for doing searches. You can open the messages live within the mailbox and just reply to them. You don't have to restore them to deal with them. And you can also restore them back into the mailbox as a user on a message by message basis. So to give you an idea there, I've selected a message, and you can see it as a full HTML message, exactly as you would expect to just look at your normal messages within Outlook. Web interface, the email client, slightly different because it's a Windows client, but you can do searches. You can export multiple messages from within the client. So you can give users rights to do things like exporting of a whole folder structure if they need that access, or you can also give users right to archive their own messages. So things like if they've got a large collection of old PSTs, that might be a logical place that users can connect to and archive them and push them back to the MailStore server. That's a quick look at the searching within the MailStore client. Web interface, it's been revamped in the latest version, really nice and straightforward. Again, you can do all of the same functions and open messages. On a mobile device, it's more of a read-only infrastructure, but it's really handy when you're out on the road and you just need access to that message. You can very quickly do a server-side search, find the information you want, and from there, utilize it on the device. It's really useful if you're just trying to find messages for a customer meeting. And then just a quick screen grab there of what it looks like when you've got a secondary email connection within Outlook in this case, but that could be any mail platform that supports IMAP. So if you've got those edge cases where you've got users that say, no, I want to use Thunderbird or I want to use Mac Mail, then you can still give them access to their archive. So let's have a look at how MailStore SPE sort of extends what you can do in MailStore Server. So the main focus of SPE is the ability to run more than one customer instance on a single server. So it's all about hosting virtual MailStore servers, effectively. Each instance works in exactly the same way as a MailStore server, and you can give users admin access as if it was a MailStore server. It's a brandable solution. So as the MSP, you can customize how it looks, how it's named, so you can use it to build a service, an archiving service for your customers. It's great in the fact that you can start small and grow it as you need to. It's a Windows-based solution. It will run on a server core, but it allows you to start with a single server environment with all the basic services. And then if you grow and you find you want to add more customers on, you can just add additional servers and join it all into one overall architecture. It's separating the customer's management from the MSP's management. So you as an MSP provide services, but if you've got customers that want to set up their own archiving or have access over when they add and remove users, that's very straightforward to do, and you can give them access to manage their instance of MailStore without having any visibility over the whole system that you manage. It's a centralized billing model. So from a cost point of view, you are being charged on a per user per month basis of a total number of users that are on the service altogether. So you can then charge your customers on a per user per month basis as well. So let's have a look at the architecture. What's involved in MailStore Server Provider Edition? Fundamentally, there's three components, and this first screenshot is really what you'd see when you first install SPE. And I just wanted to highlight these three services. So there's the management server, which is the service that the SPE customers connect to. Sorry, the SPE managers connect to, you as the administrator connect to manage the platform. The instant host is where your customers' instances exist. So each instance host may well have multiple instances. And each one is a customer, and you may have over time multiple instance hosts on different servers, but their whole role is to hold archives for customers and to go and get data from mail platforms. So that's the sort of main MailStore server component. The client access server is how clients connect to MailStore. They've separated that into a separate service, and the idea of that is that potentially if you've got some customers that are very heavy users of the clients accessing all the time, you can offload them onto dedicated servers if needed. But those are the three components. So how do they work together? So this diagram is really sort of tries to explain that. So what we've got on the left-hand side is the client's access. We start top left. We've got the they can connect in with, like I said before, the web browser, the add-in email client or IMAP, and they're connecting into the client access server. That client access server then connects through to the instance hosts. Now, this could be all on one server at the moment, and each one of those instance hosts is one of your customers, but there's only one client access server that's managing those customers. The management server is sat behind, allowing you to manage the whole setup, and that's accessed over its own port from you, typically firewalled from your organization, so only you can manage the infrastructure. All of the interconnecting protocols are all encrypted. There are no protocols within MailStore SPE that allow you to do things, over plain text password. I mean, that's absolutely key when you're offering any sort of service mail platform these days for customers. And like I said, because they're on separate ports, you can highly customize your firewalls to decide exactly what can connect to what. So customers can connect to client access servers, but they don't need to connect to instance hosts. You can connect to the management server to manage it, but you don't, as a manager, you don't need to actually connect to the client access server or the instance host from that network. So you can really customize exactly how things are accessed. The data that's collected from different email platforms, so I'm going to keep it simple and kind of focus on Office 365. Again, that's all done over encrypted connections. So your instance host will be connecting out to Office 365 servers over HTTPS and polling it for new mail, just like an Outlook web access connection would happen on the client's point of view. MailStore in that environment is really acting as if it was multiple Office 365 clients connecting, or Office 365 Outlook clients connecting. And likewise, the directory services synchronization again is all done over a secure port, so it's typically an LDAP secure connection. So let's have a look at the two server models. I mentioned here early on single server versus multiple server. Now, really what I'm trying to get across with these couple of slides is just to explain that when you start out with MailStore SPE, it's really straightforward. You can do everything, the management server, the client access server, and the instance host, all on one hardware, one piece of hardware, one physical server. And it's the easiest way to set it up. It's how my lab's set up at the moment. And you can use it like that until you feel that that hardware has got to the point that it's maybe, hasn't got the resources to handle any more customers, at which point you can switch to a multi-server mode. You're not really switching at all. What you're doing is just adding another instance host somewhere and saying, right, connect through to the management server, and it becomes another instance host to use. And that's when we effectively see this idea of having two servers, one of which has the management server, and the other one has a new client access server and a new instance host. You can utilize that in other ways as well. You can do load balancing. So I've had scenarios where SPE customers have said, well, I've got a primary client access server URL that my customers connect to, but if they feel that's being slow, there's a secondary one. You can take it further. You could put a load balancing service in front of this if you wanted to. I'm not going to go into that depth today. It's more of a general overview, but basically the concept of how they've designed the components and how they work together allows it to be very flexible and to grow into a much bigger solution. I've actually got my number wrong there, but I mentioned this 250 users, actually it's 300 users. We tend to sort of think about these installations, the licensing is suited for 300 users per physical server, but it also fits in really well with hosting charges, which I'll cover a little bit later on. So there is this 300 user sort of sweet spot of how big you would make a server, because typically it's up to you if you host 30 customers or 2 customers. But again, you can it's very flexible and allows you to move them around if you feel that it would be better to have one server with lots of small customers on and another server that's maybe dedicated to 1 or 2 customers. It's very easy to do that and move things in the future. So let's have a quick look at some of the system requirements. And I want to introduce the online calculator now, which is specifically our MailStore site. There's a link at the bottom. Obviously, you can ask me for these at the end if you need them. And this calculator allows you to sort of imagine, well, if I was to build a server and I wanted to archive for 300 users across up to 20 instances and keep 10 years worth of email, what am I talking about? What sort of hardware do I need? Now, the first thing I want to point out, from a journaling point of view, there's a lot less work going on. So if you can see there, the processor requirement, 4 cores and 16 gig of RAM for the journaling scenario. If I switch to a mailbox-based archiving, so if all of my instances were all doing mailbox archiving, that suddenly jumped significantly to 20 cores. RAM's about the same, to be honest, but the number of threads, the number of simultaneous connections to go and archive different mailboxes is grown dramatically. So it's really worth thinking early on about whether you want to do journaling or mailbox archiving, because that really does limit how far you can stretch the hardware, or really what hardware you need to choose. But yeah, the system calculator is a really good place to go to start sort of playing with ideas and thinking about, if I was to use this particular server, what would it be capable of? So I summarise that here just to sort of give you an idea of what a 300 user server would need. And we're not talking huge resources at all. I mean, these are very typical sort of server spec machines in a hosting environment. It's a very low cost. And I think I will slide a little bit later on when we actually talk about the costs involved in hosting such a server. But bear in mind from a storage point of view, you typically with MailStore, what you would do is you'd have 2 sets of storage. One very fast storage for the database indexes and for the searches, and one larger storage, which is your actual customers' archives. That way you get the most out of the hardware. From a software point of view, you can see it's pretty straightforward. It's a Windows Server OS, and like I said before, it can also run on Server Core, obviously a .NET requirement, but it doesn't require any SQL Server licenses, doesn't require IIS, so there's no worry about having to pay for additional Microsoft licenses there. Typically, what most customers will run it on is in on a server 2008, or these days, to be honest, it's all run on 2016. So let's have a quick look at what the management console actually looks like. So when you first install it, if you haven't done already, the very first thing you're going to be asked is, do you want to build as a single server mode or a multi-server mode? Typically, I would say just start with a single server mode. You can always come back later and convert it into a multi-server, unless you're familiar with Mailstore and you're already ready to deploy it across several servers. Single server's the way to go. So this is the first sort of section in really the main application within server in SPE mode. You've got the three sections, the three different services. When you configure them, and I won't go into too much depth here, but you have to sort of tell it which ports, and I'd stick to the standard ports by default, they're running on, and the certificate is the SSL certificate it's going to use on that service. So out of the box, Mailstore will run on self-signed certificates that it's created itself. That's what that certificate ID relates to. It's one it's created. And if you're just building a lab environment, that's absolutely fine. Obviously, you're going to get warnings about SSL certificates when you connect clients and things, but as long as you're happy with that, it's very quick to get up and running. If you're building a solution specifically for a live environment for your customers, you're really going to need to purchase a root trusted certificate for each physical server you install MailStore SPE on, and then every service can use that certificate. So in this example, from the outside world, my server is going to be referred to as mailstore.emailarchive.co.uk. The certificate would need to match that, and that's the URL that I'm going to use for my customers. It'll be different for each customer. There'll be a subfolder, which you'll see later on, but that's the public name and the URL that they're going to need to use. When you configure the instance host, you're effectively saying this instance host needs to be paired with a particular management server. So in the case of a single server installation, obviously it's the same server, but you still have to go through the process of just pairing that to make sure that it knows that it's talking to a relevant management server. And the same is true for the client access server. The difference here is that the client access server is where you decide, well, what services do I offer to my clients? Do I just do Outlook Web Access or over 443, or do I, sorry, not Outlook Web Access, Outlook add-in for the client over 443, just standard HTTPS, or do I also turn on the IMAP services? If you're not using the IMAP services, you could easily just turn them off, you don't need them. That is fundamentally the only configuration you need to do to set up MailStore SPE. From now on, you're then into the web interface. So I'm just going to switch now to a live demo. Just while I'm doing that, I'm just going to quickly just look through the chat and see if there's anything that's been mentioned. Oh, sorry, Sam. Yeah, I think James has jumped in. Yeah, MailStore is purely for archiving mail. There is no archiving capabilities to do with calendar or contacts, I'm afraid. Okay, so let's switch to the. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see my demo here. So once you've installed the MailStore SPE, it's up and running, you would then have to point your browser to the management interface. So the URL is HTTPS. Obviously, I'm using a self-signed certificate, so I'm getting these lovely warnings. And the port from the screen before is 8470. So that's what you would connect to. You can obviously do that from your own machine. You don't have to be connecting to it on the server. I am here because it's easy for me to demonstrate it this way. And then what you see on the main dashboard is really your infrastructure. So this is, like I say, a single server setup. You've got your management server at the top left here, and it's connected to one instance host on the same machine and one client access server on the same machine. And this is where all my instances, all my customers exist, of which I've got 4 demonstration customers set up. And this is where my clients connect to. If I, in the future, grew this service and I said, right, I'm going to set up a second server and I'm going to install it as a multiple server setup, I would then have the choice to add another instance host or client access server or both. And then I pointed to this management server that I've already built, and I'd have a table then of multiple instance servers and multiple client access servers. You'd still manage it all through the one interface. It just build up over time. So let's have a look at my instances. Let me just move this out of the way. So instances are your customers, and each instance is effectively like installing a MailStore server instance, which is where the name comes from, and it has its own process ID because it's it is a separate process running on this machine. What's probably the easiest way to explain is how I would go about creating a new customer. So let's do exactly that. Let's create a new instance. Now we need to give a name, an instance ID, but this is really just a name for yourself. So you can have a naming convention that you use. You probably already have a unique identifier for each one of your customers anyway. Ooh, it would help if I used one that I think you're limited to. I may have already done one called that in the past. Oh, is it because I'm using uppercase? No. So why am I told I can't use demo customer? No, too long. Okay, so once you've got a name that fits the criteria, you give the customer a name. Now, the URL alias is what a customer sees. When they connect to the client, when they set up their clients or where they use the web interface, they're going to have to type in a URL. And it's this code, so generally you want something short or something that refers to them but isn't too hard for them to type, that they actually connect to. I would then choose which instance host I want to host this customer on. I've only got the one, so obviously I can only select the one, but this is where you'd have a list of multiple instance hosts if you had a bigger setup. I want to start it automatically, and then I want to choose the local directory on this Windows server where I want to store this customer's database. Now, obviously, this is a simple solution. It's one single server. If you start developing this further and you have a centralized store that's on a SAN on the same network, obviously that's going to be another option here for you. But just to keep things simple, I'm just going to use a secondary drive here where I've set up all my instances, and I'll create a new customer folder here. Let's just call it demo customer. I'm set up. Now, just before I go any further, one thing I want to point out for later, but I'll probably come back to this, is the I can't speak today, advanced configuration. In here, this is where you'll find the ability to enable the VSS writer. That's to do with how you can back it up. So typically you would turn it on at this stage, but you can come back and enable this later. And if you're doing any sort of debug login or server connection login, this is the same location. So okay that, and just let it go through the process of setting up a new customer instance. Just take a few seconds, hopefully, to just provide that. There we go. First tip of the day, when you get to this point and it says, oh, I've created you a new instance, this is the admin username and password, it's automatically created an admin account for your customer for them to log into MailStore, and that's its password. You don't necessarily have to use that, and I'll show you in a minute how we can change that. But you will only see that password at this point. If I click OK, that password's gone now and I'll never be able to find it. I'll have to change it, which, to be honest, is the easiest option in my opinion. But if you're in the habit of quickly sort of deploying them, you're going to need to paste that, copy and paste that, so you've got a copy of it. I'm not going to use that password, and I'll show you why I don't need to in a minute. So that's a new customer set up. How do I use that instance? Let's pull things up a bit so we can see what's going on. I'm going to go a little bit higher. There we go. Okay. So first things first, let's look at the settings. Well, this is what I've just created. So yeah, there's the user, the base directory, the actual folder on the server where all of this customer's data exists. What archive stores does it have? The archive stores are your responsibilities here as the MSP. They are folders on your server where your customers' encrypted data are stored. Customers don't see this. This is where it's slightly different to MailStore server, where in the instance you can manage different archive stores. MailStore by default will automatically create new archive stores every 5 million messages. We tend personally to drop that to 500,000. I find that 5 million is a lot of messages to deal with if you're ever moving or checking the health of a store. So personally, I drop that to typically 500,000 or possibly 1 million or 2 million if they're bigger deployments. It's not a huge issue if you leave it on 5 million, but that's my personal preference. So every 500,000 messages, a new store will be created automatically, but they work together as one big archive. Accessing the archive, as the service provider, you get access directly to the archive when you enable this option, which is logged in the audit logs. So you can tell your customers that somebody can't just look at their data, and I'll show you what you can and can't look at in a minute anyway. But you can't even get into the instance without enabling the option, downloading the client, which is the MailStore client, and then opening the client. I've already downloaded the client on this machine, but you can always download it straight away. You can also get access to the Outlook add-in from here if you need to. When you open the client, and if you're used to MailStore server, this is where it might be slightly different. You're actually connecting to a HTTPS address. Now it's pre-populated this as being HTTPS, the server that I've created and named as MailStore Email Archive .co.uk. Notice it's port 443 because this is the standard management interface now. It's not 8470, that's for the management backend. This is for managing each instance / the URL that I created. And it's going to log in as $archive admin as the main user. Now that is a special user that you as the SPE are using to administrate the instance. And you'll see why that's important in a minute. So if I click yes and continue, that should launch. I think it's down here actually. There it is. So that launches a MailStore instance for this customer. Now I'm not going to go through every sort of setting here. That's really covered in a separate video about how you use MailStore. But the one thing I want to explain is that I'm now logged in, if we look at our users, as this one special account, which isn't part of the licensing. It's counted as a user, funny enough, but it's not. This is purely for you to administrate the server. That's the admin user that your customers use to go in and administrate the server. And it's that account that if you've lost that password from before, that you can go into the password field and define a password for them. Ideally, what you want to happen is when a customer sets up MailStore, they log in and they set up the jobs, because that way, when you've got any archive jobs set up in the future under here, they will show up under their login, not as the $archive admin user. And that's quite important, but there's a mixed opinion on this one. Sometimes MSPs want to manage all the jobs for their customer. They don't want the customer to even see the jobs. They just want them to see the archives. Then there's no harm in just logging in and creating the jobs now. What I tend to do is if you've got customers that want to be able to manage those jobs in the future, log in, change the admin password, and then re-log in as their customer as the admin account and set up the jobs under their context so that they can see them, they can manage them in the future. So along with, effectively, we've set up a customer. What else can you see as an MSP as far as managing that customer's instance? Well, there's some live statistics here which give you a general overview of how loaded that particular customer's instance is right now. So you can see things like the memory and the size of the archive and how much I/O on the disks is happening live. So it helps you spot if one of your customers is really hammering all the resources of the server. There's a CPU load down there. The other sort of key thing that you're going to want to see with it often is the licensing information. So you can see here I've already got, move that down a little bit, I've got a handful of customers, but I don't know how many users each one of those customers has got running. It's up to the customer really to decide how many accounts they create, because they're synchronizing with their own AD or with Office 365, however they're synchronizing their users. Their user count may be changing on a day-by-day basis. What's the total number of users across the whole site, and what are you going to be charged for as an MSP? Well, that's listed under here under the licensing information. So you can see now that each one of the sites that, well, these are not really been configured yet, they've just got the one user. This site has got 5 users, this site's got 3 users. So this is the information that's being sent back to the licensing server to say this is how many users are on this entire server. think I'm slightly out of sync here, but let me just switch back to the presentation. Here it is. Yeah, right, yeah. So just some tips and tricks. When you're setting up instances, what things can you do to minimize really the load on the server? Because the more you work that each instance does, the more the lower number of users, lower number of customers each server supports. So effectively, you less money you can get out of each server. The key important thing is what type of jobs you set up. If you set up a job that's archiving a whole mailbox and you run that job every 5 minutes and it's constantly polling, even though the job is going to cache that data and be much more efficient the second time it runs, times that by 200 users, that's still load you don't necessarily need. So how often you run those jobs is important. Typically, I would say mailbox jobs don't need to be run more often than once an hour, especially if you're also journaling, because if you're journaling and you've got that compliancy coming in, really the mailbox job is just a way of mopping up where messages have been filed by users. So it's not as critical to be run so often. Some customers just run mailbox jobs once a day. So yes, whether you're doing journaling or mailbox, how often you're running those jobs. Running jobs in office hours, again, when you run that in the day, if you can run things overnight when there's less load, if the server's also the client access server, then obviously you've got more resources available for users to connect to and perform the searches, so that's helpful. You can also, in MailStore, people often forget that you can create jobs and duplicate jobs, but make them very specific. So for example, I've had jobs in the past that are designed to just look at the deleted items folder. For every user, but look at every user, only look at the deleted items folder and prune it down to 30 days once a day. And I might have another job that's looking specifically at different folders that are shared folders or public folders. Because I know that those need to be dealt with more often, it's better to have a unique job that's focused on what it's doing, because that's generally a lot less load. And then the general job that runs once a day to look at all of the users' mailboxes can be left. If they particularly want things to be sorted in certain folders more often, create a job to do exactly that. Final sort of thing you can do, you might get to a point where you've got many instances on a server, but you want to, you're finding that server is now reaching its capacity. How do you move a customer to another instance? Well, really, it's a simple case. If I just switch back to the server, if we look at our instances, I mentioned that they're stored in each folder on the server. It's really just a case of stopping the instance. It's as simple as stopping the instance. There you go, stop now. And changing that folder or moving that folder to a new server. If you literally copy that folder data, if we take that folder, copy it to a new instance server, put it any path and create a new instance, but point it to that folder, instantly that instance is then running on the new server. So it's actually really easy to move them around. Everything for that customer is self-contained within that folder. Their data, their configuration database, their actual archive stores are all within that one folder, including their own logs. So it does make it very easy to move around and reload and redistribute across multiple servers in the future, should you need to. If you're starting simple and you've got one server, then it's just, just keep adding them up here. Or it might be that you start to think, well, I'm running out of space on this drive. Fine, move them to stop an instance, move it to a different drive, edit the instance to tell it where the root folder is on the new drive and carry on. This kind of leads me into the backup option. So I've kind of already covered this. So I mentioned early on the VSS writer. That's absolutely key. If you're going to do any backup of MailStore instances with them running, because you obviously want to leave them running all the time, you need to enable the VSS writer on each instance so that your backup software can communicate with MailStore, make sure the data is not changing whilst it's being backed up. It does that through its own VSS writer. The sub option there, people often ask me, do I need to include or exclude the indexes from the VSS backup? If you want your backup to run quicker, you can tick that option to exclude them. Search indexes can be recreated dynamically. It takes some time, but can be recreated at any time. So if you want to minimize the size of your backup and minimize the time it takes to run that backup, that's a good option to choose. Because obviously you don't need to, the indexes can add up to quite a large amount of data. I mentioned that you can restore or you can move data between instances, between the instance hosts rather. Again, if you've got a backup of the whole data that's VSS aware and worst comes to worst, the whole server gets destroyed, then it's easy to just restore that data as files into any new Windows server, install MailStore SPE, set up new instances of the same name, which is probably the trickiest part. You want to keep a log of what all your instances are called, but that, as you saw, is quite a quick process, and you could easily recreate all of the instances. And that's if all you had was the customer's data. If you backed up the whole server, then obviously you could just restore it as a disaster recovery. The backups that you can have, the data is really quite good in the sense that it's very efficient if you send it off site. So, I've put some examples there for using Backup Assist. There's nothing stopping you backing up this data to cloud servers like S3, Azure, or even to network devices over WebDAV. Or you could back it up to local network shares or iSCSI targets. I would highly recommend that with this customer data, it's impeccable that you have backups and you have backups with history. So you need to sort of factor that in when you're designing a solution for customers. Which kind of leads me into the sort of hosting costs. I mentioned early on the sort of hardware specs for a 300 user setup. We're looking here at sort of the journaling, scenario with a sort of lower spec of server hardware. We did a bit of, James and I did a bit of looking around at different host providers. OVH was one that kept cropping up as being a really good cost point for hosted servers. I mean, there's many out there, so feel free to decide to use your own hardware on site within co-location services or dedicated server hosting, or even if you want to look at cloud hosting like AWS or Azure, bear in mind you might find that the sort of hardware specs when you go down cloud hosted, the costs do add up. So you've really got to think about exactly what you're getting for your money. Our best advice I can give you here is going with a dedicated physical host provider is definitely the most cost-effective solution. So I've highlighted an example there of a server that would be more than capable of looking after 300 customers, and we're talking about the base figure of about £62 a month. When you start breaking that down, so this is an example of what the MailStore recommendation would be for that server, 4 cores, 4 threads, 16 gig of RAM. The actual server is 4 cores, 8 threads and 32 gig of RAM. Great, got plenty of RAM. What I actually need is one RAID array or one storage that's super quick, so SSD, RAID 1 in that example, but I need a second larger installation. Well, that's where the hosting provider would add you, a bit of extra cost. So my total sort of real world figure, we're looking at about £100 per month, including the Windows licensing. So that's all I need to spend to build a server that's going to support 300 users across up to 20 instances, but obviously the weighting of how many users per instance is going to depend on your customers. Some may be smaller than others. You may end up with 15 instances, you may end up with 4 instances. How that 300 users is split is totally up to you. But it gives you some real sort of world figures to work with. So I think my slides are out of order here. Okay, so the main differences on the licensing model with SPE is it's billed per user per month, as opposed to MailStore Server, where you buy it up front on a yearly basis for a number of users. So it means that you can allow your customers to add users and remove users on a monthly basis and charge them for the maximum number of users they've reached in that month. So really suitable for customers where they've got staff turnover. And they're worried about, buying 30 licenses up front and then they might only have 25 users the next month, or they might grow to 45. There's a lot of back and forth with this MailStore Server licensing model to be that flexible. The SPE model is, flexible on a month-by-month basis, fully automatically. From a trial point of view, it's really beneficial to for the MSP because it's a 30-day free trial period for you. So if you were to come on board today and play with SPE and build your own setup, you'd pay nothing for 30 days. Every time you bring a customer on board, they get a 30-day trial period, so you're not going to be charged from us for another 30 days, so effectively you've got 60 days. And then there's an additional 30 days payment window. So in effect, to start from today and have a customer and get them actually using it, and then the first money that's expected to pay for that is 90 days down the line. So it's a really good startup, and you can get experience of it before you're immediately having to sort of think about any payment. We obviously then support the MSP product. We're your primary contact. At the moment, it's a slightly different. It's still through MailStore directly, but we're still filtering that support. But we are in the process of becoming your primary contact for support. And as an MSP, you get your own NFR license as well, so you can set up and test for your own internal use, so you can get a feeling for the product. That slide's really there just to give you an idea of the cost brackets, because even though it's per user per month, the cost per user drops quite quickly the more users you have as a total. So if you're in the realms of several hundred users, then the price per user is significantly less. And the final sort of return slide here is just to give you an idea of, assuming you had a product and you were charging it to your customers at £3.50 per user per month, what sort of number of users would you need to start making money? Well, we've done the cost modeling, and based on that server quote from before, you're between 50 and 100 users. So we're not talking huge numbers to actually start making a profitable service. And if you can get, further that quickly and get into the hundreds of users, there's good profit margins to be made here. So, definitely have a look at your cost model early on. We're here to help. James and I, spent a lot of time looking at different options of what the total cost would be. So, you guys can really, make some, good profit margins from this.